Hello and welcome back to another crafty video. Marianne here, and today I'm going to be creating two heart-shaped ponds featuring some koi fish, some lily pads, and some lotus flowers. I think they're called lotus flowers, and a little rower in a rowboat. Perfect cards for summer. I will be using the Calm Waters dies from the most recent Concord and Ninth summer camp to create both of my cards. Our color palette today is going to be Lakefront, Peacock, and Tide Pool, Avocado, Lemongrass, Sicily, Coral, Creamsicle, Clementine, Butterscotch, as well as Sand, Peanut, and Hazelnut. We'll also be using Shimmer Vellum and White. For our first card, we're going to be cutting a 4¼ by 5½ inch card panel out of Tide Pool, and we'll use that second panel on our second card. Then we'll be cutting a 4¼ by 11 inch piece of cardstock out of Peacock, which will then form our card base for our first card, and we'll score that at 5½ to create a top folding note card. And then with the Tide Pool card panel, we're going to create a little mat so that a little bit of the peacock is showing around the edge of the card. And so we're going to trim down that Tide Pool panel. I'm going to trim a 1/4 inch from two sides, so one of the long sides and one of the short sides, so that when we place the Tide Pool panel over our peacock card base, there will be an 1/8 inch mat around all of the edges. Then I'm going to take a heart-shaped die. This one is from a Hero Arts nesting heart-shaped die set, and I just picked one of the sort of intermediary ones that kind of fit the size of the card but wasn't too big. And I'm just going to place it on the front of my Tide Pool card panel and then get it as centered as possible and then tape it down. One of the reasons why I like to trim the card panel down first is so that way, just in case I don't get it quite centered, I don't accidentally mess it up by trimming off too much on each side. So that's why I trim it down first. And then once I'm satisfied with its placement, I'm going to run it through my die cutting machine. And we're actually going to use the negative space to again create that sort of heart-shaped pond space. So I am going to save this heart for another project, and then I'm going to overlay it so you can see kind of what it will look like with the peacock background with that sort of 1/8 inch mat around the edge. Off screen, I went ahead and die cut a bunch of the flower petals, centers, the little fish, and the lily pads out of different colors of cardstock, the ones I mentioned before. I did this off screen. I just cut out a bunch of them because I wasn't sure exactly how many flowers or lily pads or even fish I wanted to use for each card. So I just went ahead and die cut out a bunch. So for the fish, I've cut them out of white cardstock as well as shimmer vellum, and then the stripes are out of orange. So I have creamsicle and clementine. And I'm gonna trim off the little fins, the tail fin and then the side fins. And then I'm going to glue the body, the white body, on top of the shimmer vellum die cut so that the little wings, the little fins of the fish are sort of a shimmery and kind of see-through. And then I'll go ahead and glue the orange stripe on top. I'll then repeat that process for my remaining little fishes until all of them have been glued together. But this is what the fish will look like when fully assembled. I'm just going to glue down my lotus petals. So there are 4 petal sets and then 3 petal sets. So each flower will be 2, 3, and 1, 4 sort of on the bottom. And my petals are cut out of Sicily, Coral, and Nectar. And I played around with a few different layouts of whether I should do 1 petal of each color since there's sort of 3 petal layers, or all of the same color, and I ultimately decided to do a 2-1 combo. So 2 petal sets will be 1 color, and then the 3rd petal set will be a different color. And that way they aren't like so much happening, so many colors in one sort of set, but still some variety, and not just like all the same color. And I think that kind of combination worked the best. And I sort of varied it. So sometimes the two colors were next to each other and sometimes they were separated by that third color. And then each of the centers were with the buttercup sort of center. So they all have the same center. I think in total there were about 12 flowers, and I definitely didn't use all of them. So some of them I will save for a future project. It just makes me so happy looking at all of these colors. I don't know, I just really love these combinations together. I think it's so pretty and so earthy, and I'm just like so excited every time I look at it. But once I have all of my pieces glued together, I'm then going to be moving on to doing some stamping with my sentiment, which is going to say thinking of you, and it's a very thin sort of stripped sentiment that I'm going to stamp on the edge of the heart-shaped, just like right along the edge. I'm gonna line it up right on the bottom of the tip of the heart, and I'm going to stamp it. I started with Tide Pool ink to do a little tone on tone because I wanted sort of the sentiment to be kind of subtle. And then ultimately I decided that it wasn't dark enough, so I went ahead and stamped it again with Peacock ink. And I did that a couple of times to just really make sure. And when I stamped it down, I just did a really light press, so I didn't get all the ink like splooting out and like getting really like blobby letters and such. So overlaying my Tide Pool piece with my peacock background, I'm starting to add the pieces to just sort of get a sense of where I want everything to go. And I'm, laying out the fish and the flowers and the lily pads. And I realized that to me, it seemed like the peacock background was actually a little bit plain. So I ultimately decided to do a background stamp. I went ahead and picked this hexagon, these overlapping hexagons from It's a Hero Arts rubber stamp, and I wasn't quite sure about it. I was very tentative when I picked this up because I thought the hexagons weren't quite right. Like, it would have been better if they were circles, but I also thought that they kind of look like rings, like sort of like when you drop something in the water and it sort of radiates out. Um, and so I kind of just like very delicately stamped it the first time with Peacock ink, kind of like really hesitantly just doing tone on tone, and I absolutely love how it turned out. I also love that you can kind of see it on the outside. You can't really see it on the screen right now, but on the outside of the card where the mat is, you can definitely see the pattern still, which I think is really cool too. And then the fun part of assembly comes. So I have some foam tape on the back of my panel that I am gluing down to my peacock card base. I've also trimmed down some thinner, so this is not quite as thick as the foam tape on the back of the panel. So it's a little bit thinner onto the fish. So I've cut a little square in half and I'm using two pieces, which I'm then going to put on the fish to sort of have them appear like they're kind of floating in the pond. I'm also going to have some lily pads like tucked underneath the heart shape so that it looks like they're kind of in the pond and a little cut off. And those lily pads will also get the same foam tape as the fish. So again, it looks like they're floating in that water. And then the lily pads and the flowers that are going on sort of the outer edge are just going to be glued down with liquid glue. I also used some liquid adhesive on the foam squares just to give it a little bit of wiggle room. And then I just finished off gluing down the remaining pieces. And now for the finished card, I also went ahead and stamped those overlapping hexagons onto the envelope flap. And here is the finished card. I absolutely love this color palette. I love the overlapping hexagons in the background and the simplicity of the sentiment stamped right along that edge. I think this card turned out absolutely beautifully and I keep staring at it. I'm so in love with it. And moving on to the second card, I am going to cut out a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch card panel out of Peacock, and I still have that card panel for the Tide Pool as well. And then my card base is going to be out of Lakefront. So this will also be a top folding card. So I cut 4 1/4 by 11 and then scored it at 5 1/2. Also for this card, I'm going to be doing a double mat, so the tide pool on the peacock and the peacock on lakefront. So for the first mat, I'm going to trim down the peacock panel by a 1/4 inch on two sides like we did on the last card. So this will create a 1/8 inch mat around the edges. And then I'm going to trim the tide pool panel, also a 1/4 inch on two sides, and then an additional 1/8 of an inch, and that will create a 1/16 inch mat around the edge. Assuming I did my math right, I think at one point I just started to eyeball it to make sure it looked okay. So it may not be exactly those measurements. And I'll explain why I'm using 3 panels instead of 2 panels a little bit later. It will make more sense when we get there. But then I am going to use the rowboat for this. So I'm going to have the same heart shape ponds, but the little rowboat is going to sort of come up from the side like so. And just like the last card, I'm going to find a good placement for the heart-shaped pond, and I'm going to cut it out using my die cutting machine. And then off screen, I went ahead and cut out my remaining pieces. So I have the little boat pieces and then all the pieces that make up the little human. So I'm going to start gluing those pieces together. I didn't introduce any new colors here, so I'm using Tide Pool for the ribbon, Buttercup is the hat, the pants are out of Peacock, and the shirt is out of Lakefront. And then I'm using those browns, the sand, peanut, and hazelnut for the rest of my boat in person. And to attach my hat to the top of my body, I'm using 2 foam squares and then adding a little bit of liquid adhesive to give it a little bit of wiggle room before placing it down. I will admit this looks quite weird from an angle, but from the top it actually looks, like a person. From the side it looks like a very kind of flattened person, which makes sense because it's paper and it's flat. But it can be a little jarring to look at. I'm not going to glue the person down just yet. I will do it later once I've figured out the positioning of my boat, but I will glue down the top of the boat, and I added some lines using a piece of cardstock to just draw them on. This was sort of a technique that Christina Werner shared during the instruction of this video. And I guess I should mention that the first card also was kind of inspired by one of her bonus cards as well. And I thought it looked really cool because it makes it look like wood. I'm also not going to glue my oars down yet because of, again, trying to get that placement just right. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen there that I'm kind of going in this direction where the little boat is going to come up off the side of the heart-shaped pond, and there's going to be a bunch of floating lily pads and the lotus flowers. And I couldn't quite decide if I wanted the boat to be sort of coming underneath the pond, so you only see sort of the screen that's within the pond, that's sort of seen, almost like it's kind of coming through a tunnel of love, or if I wanted the boat to be on top where you could see the full boat. I agonized over this decision, and I, eventually decided that I wanted it on top, but it took me a few minutes to more than a few minutes to determine exactly which way I wanted this to go. And while I was contemplating it, I went ahead and did the same sort of hexagon background that I did on the Peacock cardstock and stamped my sentiment, this time using "Have a Lovely Day" instead of "Thinking of You." And so now the reason for the 3 layers is there is this die that sort of cuts these kind of ripples in the water, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to use it or not. So if I were to cut through the Peacock cardstock, I would be able to see the Lakefront cardstock from the card base underneath. So that was the idea of using sort of the 3 layers as opposed to 2. And again, I'm just trying to understand how much of it to show. Again, the position of the person is really relevant, also the rows. So I really just kind of went a little crazy trying to figure out the best sort of layout to get the person in the boat, as much of the boat possible within the sort of heart-shaped scene. Also make sure that the oars looked in the right place and didn't cut off my sentiment in a weird way. And I still wanted to include the lily pads and the lotus flowers. So this took quite a bit of time manipulating all these different pieces before I ultimately decided on the final layout. I did decide to cut out the ripples, and so to do this, I have taped my Tide Pool card panel onto my Peacock card panel, and I'm kind of positioning the boat where I want it with the ripple die underneath that Tide Pool panel so I can get the layout just right. So I'm going to place the oars in the positioning that I want so that um, they don't cut off that sentiment. So I'm kind of going to put the oar sort of like in the hand of the rower, but just to the edge of the sentiment. And so trying to get this placement just right. There is a little bit of wiggle room with the die that you'll see once we cut it out, but just trying to get overall the position of the boat. And once I'm satisfied with the position of the die, I'm going to remove my little rower and my rowboat. I'm going to flip up the taped panel, and then I'm going to tape down really well so it doesn't shift the die underneath. Also, I'm going to be doing some partial die cutting because that die just hangs off the edge a little bit outside of the Tide Pool panel, and I don't want that to cut all the way through. I want a nice clean border. So I'm just going to die cut, do some partial die cutting. And then when it's done, there's going to be a few pieces that don't cut fully, and so I'll just trim those with my scissors, and it will be hidden underneath that Tide Pool panel so no one will know. I also agonized over whether or not to prop up my panels with foam tape or not, and ultimately decided it would look a little too weird, like too much floating, and the boat might look weird. So I ultimately decided just to put the foam tape underneath the boat piece and then just liquid glue the panels down. I ultimately decided I wanted to go with the boat on top look rather than sort of cut off from going through the tunnel of love. And so I'm now gluing the boat down. In order to get this layout just right, I am going to kind of hold my oar in place so I can get it right on the edge of that sentiment that says have a lovely day. So it's like right on the edge, kind of like continuing the sentiment, but it doesn't cut it off. So I want to make sure that it fits nicely in the hand, but also has a good placement on the side of the pond as well. Liquid adhesive on the foam squares also gives it a little bit of wiggle room before it completely gets stuck down. I'm then going to add glue to my oars. It's going to be a little bit of a strategic placement because I need some on the sort of like the blade of the oar as well as the handle of the oar, and then right underneath where the hand, the fist will go. So that took a little bit of coordination as well. And I'll glue down my other oar and the lily pads and lotus flowers. And that brings us to our second finished card. What a journey. I also stamped the flap on this envelope as well. I absolutely just love that stamp. I think it's so beautiful. And here is the finished card. A little bit different than our first card, but again, some similarities, the similar color palette, etc. But this one has the little rower in the rowboat. And just in case you forgot, bringing in the first card that I did, and I think these pair really nicely together. I think I'm a little partial to the first card, but I think the second card is also beautiful. Let me know in the comments which one is your favorite. If you stuck with me this long, thanks so much for watching. It was a little bit longer than some of my other videos, but I hope you enjoyed it.